Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for attending our third Waynesboro Wednesday webinar. This webinar is titled Seeing Trees in the Forest. It's about the history of street tree plantings within its larger social, cultural, and political context. My name's Molly, and I am the Urban and Community Forestry Partnership Coordinator with the Virginia Department of Forestry. This is kind of bittersweet that we're hosting this year online. Last year at this time, I was holding this position for the first time at the Waynesboro workshop. So I was looking forward to seeing some familiar faces and meeting new people, but such is 2020. But anyway, Adam, if you want to go to the next slide. Okay, so like I mentioned, this is the third Waynesboro webinar. We have 5 scheduled for each of the Wednesdays in September. We have 2 more left. The next one is next week, September 23rd, from noon to 1, and it's entitled Green Industry in the Woods and Weeds, Expanding Your Business with Woodland Health Services to New and Existing Clients. Thank you, Adam and Joe, for making that super long title. Adam Downing with Virginia Tech Extension and Joe Leenan with Department of Forestry will be hosting that. So be sure to check in. And the final webinar series is called Urban Tree Canopy Cover, Structure, Function, and Assessment. And that will be hosted by Dr. Eric Wiseman out of Virginia Tech. Just a quick plug here for Trees Virginia. Trees Virginia has been working really hard alongside of Virginia Cooperative Extension and the Department of Forestry to put on these Waynesboro workshops every Wednesday. So if you have a little bit of change left in your pocket, we encourage you to donate to Trees Virginia. All of the donations from given to Trees Virginia goes into our scholarship pool. The scholarships are awarded every year to students in arboriculture and in urban forestry. So if you have a little extra something, we appreciate it if you would donate. The last thing I want to mention before I introduce our speaker is about the CEU credits for this webinar. So this webinar, just like the other ones, are approved for 1 ISA, VNLA, and SAF CEU. Each individual must fill out the questionnaire at the very end of the webinar. Your webinar or your questionnaire will either automatically pop up on your screen, and if it doesn't, then that's totally fine. You will regardless receive an email from Trees Virginia with the link of the questionnaire. You need to fill it out within 24 hours in order to receive credit. We've had some issues kind of tracking down some of the CEUs that had been submitted at a later time. So please be sure to answer that questionnaire within 24 hours of getting that link. And without further ado, I get to introduce our speaker today. This is Dr. Sonja Dumpelmann. She is a landscape historian and associate professor with the University of Pennsylvania Stuart Weitzman School of Design. Her research and writing focuses on 19th and 20th century landscape history and contemporary landscape architecture in the Western world, with a particular focus on the urban environment in Germany, Italy, and United States. She is the author of Seeing Trees, a history of street trees in New York City and Berlin, and is a fellow at the Berlin Institute for Advanced Study. And she's actually joining us from Germany today. So we really appreciate her willingness and her time to spend this hour with us. So before Sonja gives her talk, I want to turn it back over to Adam for some housekeeping.
Thank you. Very nicely done. It's great to be here with y'all. Somewhere on your screen, you have something that looks like this, okay? and it has a little audio settings. So if you can't hear, you can adjust that or change your, but this is the main thing we want you to see. This chat, that's what some of you have been doing. Ignore that. This is what we want you to use, Q&A. If you have a question, please use the Q&A. There are a lot of people on this webinar, and we don't want to lose track of questions, which is what happens when they're put into the chat, okay? So please use the Q&A feature, and we will handle those at the end of the session, either by typing or Ashley Appling, my colleague with the Cooperative Extension, will be facilitating the Q&A at the end. All right, Sonja, you're free to take over the screen sharing.
Okay, fantastic. So, oops, there we go. Hopefully everybody can see this now. Yes, great. So hello everybody. Thank you to Molly, Adam, and Ashley, and of course Laura Johnson for inviting me to do this today. I'm actually very excited. I find it wonderful to be speaking with you all in the US as I'm here in Berlin. So, I will be presenting a lecture with a lot of images, and this will take me around 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. And of course, I think you probably are used to this by now. I think we are fielding questions and comments through the chat while I'll be speaking. So trees in general have played an important role for us humans as long as we can remember. And we have a special relationship with trees and plants, as we saw in the chat right now, which is also often given expression in trees anthropomorphization. So in playful ways, this anthropomorphization blurs distinctions between nature and culture. Some Greek myths, for example, include dryads that are half tree, half woman, or women that morph into trees, as seen in this 16th century illustration. A more recent example are these smiling winter trees. We're not quite there yet. And the trees in these cartoons, which I'll leave for just a moment for you to actually look at. So trees are thirsty, and this is a illustration, a photograph that was taken in 1945, just a couple of months after the end of the Second World War. And somebody planted this young horse chestnut tree and appended this note to this young tree. And what it says on that note is, "I am thirsty" in Berlin slang. So street trees are obviously thirsty. More tragically, they can commit suicide, they need surgery, they also need chemotherapy, and their diseases have been diagnosed with the help of endoscopy and computer tomography. And of course, there's perhaps no other location where people and trees come together more closely than in our cities, except of course, if you're living in a forest. So street trees are therefore often the subject of distress and pleasure, of complaints and praise, and of hatred and passion, and they elicit strong emotions either way. Some of the biggest urban conflicts have revolved around them. They have stood at the very core of events that have shaped and characterized the evolution of the modern city. And in the second half of the 19th century, when trees were first planted systematically along streets through entire cities, urbanists and designers, tree experts and arborists, city officials and citizens had to resolve this growing tension between the modernization of the city on the one hand and the conservation of trees. So some of the conflicts you see here, so these experts and agents had to deal with the tensions between nativism and globalism, the vernacular and modernity, nature's agency and human actors, but also between technology, science, economy, and aesthetics. And the history of street tree planting therefore offers insights into how our relationship with nature and the city has changed over time. And that's what I'm particularly interested in my work in general, how this relationship between humans and non-human nature has changed over time. So street trees have been considered variously as aesthetic makeup, creators of space, territorial markers, instruments of defense, emancipation and empowerment, sanitizers, air conditioners, nuisance, upholders of moral values, economic engines, scientific instruments, and ecological habitat. So in the following, I will give you an overview over some of the main ideas and topics that I have dealt with in a recent book called Seeing Trees, and which reveal and exemplify how political both the nature and culture, or perhaps we could more fittingly say, how political both, or the nature culture of trees in our cities actually is. So trees as something that is also created, trees that are produced, of course, by us humans and are altered by us humans. So this book, Seeing Trees, is a book about trees in New York City and Berlin, but many of the frameworks and findings that I offer can actually also be mapped on other cities, even though the specificity of time and place is, of course, key in every street tree story, as you will know. So I will not go into the reasons for selecting these two cities here, and I'm happy to talk about that if it's of interest. Suffice it to say that there has been a lot of exchange between, exchange of tree knowledge and expertise between the United States and Germany. And so tree seeds and cultivars, as well as the practices of street tree planting and care and technologies and machines were exchanged between people, cities, and countries. And so to give you an example, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, both New York City and Washington, D.C. in the US aspired to create a tree-lined showcase street modeled on Berlin's historic Unter den Linden, which you see here. So plantings along Massachusetts Avenue in DC, which this photograph shows, and also Broadway north of Columbus Circle in New York City were not merely intended to copy Unter den Linden in Berlin, but they were actually to outdo Berlin's tree-lined boulevards. So the Americans had a little bit of this one-upmanship going on there. And in turn, almost a century later, in the 1990s, the most common linden cultivar on Berlin's famous boulevard was Little Leaf Linden Greenspire. And this is a cultivar that was bred by William the Flemer III at his Princeton nursery in the US and was patented in 1961 and then reached a global market, including Berlin's Unter den Linden in the decades that followed. So as much as street trees were planted for their aesthetic effects, they were also always planted for their climatological function. So here you actually see this new cultivar that was bred at the Princeton nursery, and of course the climatological function that is tested here in a wind channel in a laboratory with a tree model, of course. This is not a full-grown real tree. So the idea to combat climate change and improve urban microclimates through street tree planting campaigns, as they have been carried out in the last decades in New York City with the Million Trees campaign, is not a new idea. And neither is the method of CO2 compensation to slow down climate change and reduce the warming of the atmosphere. In fact, in 1958, Chauncey D. Leakey, who was the president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, warned of, and I'm quoting him, the tremendous increase in the blanket of carbon dioxide that would inevitably tend to increase heat capture from the sun. So he warned of this in a very widely received paper at the National Conference on Air Pollution in Washington, D.C., already in the 50s. And he asked what we would do once the huge polar ice caps melted, leading to sea level rise, and then suggested that we should be planting 10 trees for every automobile and 100 for every truck. In both Berlin and New York City, the first initiatives for systematic street tree planting in the late 19th century go back to concerns about the respective cities' climate and also related public hygiene. Street trees were considered both shade trees and ornamental trees. So they were considered trees that were pleasing to look at, and trees that had cooling effects. They were also thought of as instruments that could reduce modern nervousness in this process of cooling the atmosphere. So New York City's poor sanitary and hygienic conditions were exacerbated in the late 19th century due to population growth and increasing industrialization. It was then that New York City's eminent physician Stephen Smith, who pioneered the city's sanitary reforms and founded the Metropolitan Board of Health, argued that trees could save lives. Smith was the author of a groundbreaking study that correlated children's mortality from diarrheal diseases with high temperatures. Based upon his statistics in the 1870s, he concluded that climate mitigation in the city could save up to 8,000 lives per year. And for this purpose, Smith recommended planting street trees. To illustrate the enormous effectiveness attributed to trees' climatological and cooling function, Smith drew attention to what became known as the Washington Elm Study. Attributed to Harvard College mathematics professor Benjamin Peirce, the study claimed that the famous Washington elm standing on the Cambridge Common had an estimated crop of 7 million leaves that would amount to an area of 5 acres that was active in gas exchange. These numbers help to substantiate and rationalize the shade and cooling effect of trees that individuals at this point in time commonly only perceived subjectively. So Smith not only drafted and introduced into the legislature a bill for the establishment of a Bureau of Forestry and the cultivation of street trees, but given the bill stalled and was only passed in 1902, and then actually still did not provide the necessary structure and budget for municipal street tree planting, Smith also became active in the Private Tree Planting Association. And this association assisted residents in tree planting and established a tenement shade tree committee. And this committee then planted trees along tenement blocks and in front of public schools, as you can see here on occasion of Arbor Day in downtown Manhattan. The association's first list of members read like a New York City who's who. And so besides Smith, it included philanthropist and housing reformer Robert D. Forrest, art dealer Samuel Avery, sculptor Augustus Gaudens, industrialist and former mayor Edward Cooper, and then also the bankers J.P. Morgan, William Baird Cutting, and William Collins Whitney, and many others. The sponsorship of today's tree planting campaigns by multinational corporations like Toyota, who was, for example, a lead sponsor for 1 Million Trees in New York City, therefore, as you can see, has a precedent. And Morgan's, Cuttings, and Whitney's 19th century financial empires already spanned the world, and the man may even have been aware of urban tree entanglements in far-reaching ecological networks. But at the time, of course, they were, of course, mostly concerned about the local climate and the aesthetics of their business headquarters. So one of the key observations and underlying the stories that I tell in this particular book is the fact that in the process of cultivating trees and planting them along streets, cities were naturalized and trees were urbanized. So in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, tree planting became an integral part of the urbanization process, transcending the artificial distinctions between rural and urban, natural and cultural. And in their search for what German experts called a Musterbaum and what early American city foresters called the ideal or model tree, nurserymen tried to cultivate a new ideal street tree that would meet the social and economic requirements in the city. So a tree that could resist air and soil pollution, did not attract insects, that had a small and narrow crown adapted to restricted space and lacking light, and that lost its leaves late in the year and in a short time period. I always feel a little sorry for this so-called model tree. It had to just be everything. But anyway, so species with character traits beyond easy human control were considered unsuitable. So for example, the cottonwood was thought inappropriate because it shed its leaves not its leaves, sorry, its seed in a downy, cottony tuft that clung to the clothing of passers-by, causing annoyance. This so-called summer snow, created by poplar seeds, in this case in the middle of summer in Helsinki, was considered undesirable by early 20th century New Yorkers. So trees planted in rows and in regular order were to render the city beautiful, civilized, refined, and attractive. But within the uniformity that street trees could provide, it was also considered important to have variety. In the US, in Washington, D.C., this city basically set an early example for a comprehensive, unifying, yet variable street tree system already in the 1870s, planting different tree species in different streets. More ephemeral effects like tree color also played a role in providing variety, as did the shadow cast by trees. To achieve the serial street tree aesthetic, systematic tree planting and care was necessary. So for this purpose, tree experts sought to institute a managerial and administrative system. In New York City in 1914, Stephen Smith, again, organized for the first street tree survey to be undertaken in Manhattan. Landscape engineering professors Henry Francis and Laurie Cox from the New York State College of Forestry at Syracuse University surveyed street trees using a system of index cards and maps and drew up a first street tree system for the island of Manhattan, which you see here. So all the streets that are marked in red here were the streets that were to be planted with trees. So these men also made recommendations for new administrative units and that were to manage street tree planting and care in the city, like this one here. They also developed proposals to standardize protective elements like tree guards and grates. But to maintain the ideal street tree and its aesthetic appeal as part of a series also meant maintaining symmetrical tree crowns. Asymmetry signified improper care and disease. So to produce vital street trees of the same symmetrical form and dimension in big numbers, tree experts suggested the employment of a new optical instrument called the dendroscope. Imported to the US from France, where it had been invented in the 1860s for use on country estates, this handy contrivance was to guarantee the most beautiful canopy shape. So you see this man holding the dendroscope, essentially a cardboard or a very thin wooden board with a hole in the shape of a tree in it, as the one on the left-hand side. So holding that board at the level of the eye while moving around the tree, its operator could give instructions to the pruner to achieve the desired tree shape. By cutting the tree into the shape that was projected onto it through the dendroscope, three-dimensional nature was made to copy the ideal shape of the two-dimensional picture plane. And through the use of the dendroscope, street trees could be basically forced into shape. That was the idea. The dendroscope could help to economize arboriculture and standardize tree shape and urban beautification. So as shown by the dendroscope, practices commonly applied to trees outside of cities were actually transferred to the city. If tree guards had been used to protect trees on pastures against the appetites of livestock, as you see in the illustration on the left-hand side, in the city, the two photographs here, they saved street trees from hungry horses and urinating dogs. Before the rise of motor traffic, most mechanical injuries to trees were caused by horses munching away at street trees used as hitching posts, as you can see in these illustrations. And this could actually reach extremes, as this photograph testifies. I hope you can see this. It's not very good quality, but see the bites that these horses took from each individual tree on either side of the street. Basically, there's no tree left. So they had, they were nibbling away there. Whereas the cavities of notable old trees had for centuries been boarded up or filled with various natural materials, by the early 20th century, so-called modern, what were considered at least to be modern materials like concrete fillings had become a standard practice, ostensibly prolonging street trees' lives. Tree and bird conservation efforts also began outside of urban areas, leading to enthusiastic responses in cities by the turn of the century. So street trees were planted to provide bird habitats, and bird sanctuaries, baths, feeding stations, and nesting boxes were established throughout public parks. It had become clear that birds were needed to keep insects at bay who otherwise would harm trees. Although street trees were planted first and foremost for aesthetic and climatological purposes, that means they're more intangible and immaterial qualities, at various moments throughout the 20th century, particularly in times of crisis, they also became a life-saving material resource, turning the city into a forest or orchard that could be harvested. So street trees therefore turned the city into a territory in which natural resources were actually also produced and not only consumed. For example, in March 1945, that means only 7 weeks before German capitulation in the Second World War, the German Reich Committee for the Utilization of Unfermented Fruit, yes, that was such a thing. So that committee requested that Berlin's district departments of gardens enlist all mountain ash standing along the city's streets as vitamin providers for Berlin's population. So since 1934, research into vitamins, their sources, and industrial production had been part of Nazi biopolitics that sought to create a healthy, resilient, and strong people ready to fight and then win a war. So due to the high vitamin C content in mountain ash berries, the species' upright growth and its high and loose yet beautifully shaped canopy, this committee for the utilization of unfermented fruit considered the mountain ash an ideal roadside tree that could also provide the country and its military with life-saving vitamins. With the advancement of the Allied forces on German territory by the beginning of 1945, it had become clear that Berlin itself would need to provide the necessary resources for its citizens' survival. So in response to this request by the committee, one of the garden departments reported around 680 trees of the Sorbus family standing along the district streets, including mountain ash. And it estimated that each tree could provide 1.5 kilograms of food, but they were really skeptical of this endeavor and very weary of the additional work involved, and really stressed the berry's bitterness and its inability and the inability of the department to provide the necessary labor to collect them. And this is, of course, in the last stretches of the World War. So the Allies, of course, defeated Germany and Berlin only some weeks later. But of course, the necessity to provide for food and life-saving vitamins was as current as ever. So a year later, mountain ash was actually among the species subject to a new decree for the protection of all wild woody fruit species in Berlin. The decree sought to secure life-saving resources and solve a vital conflict, because many fruit-bearing trees and shrubs were actually being used as firewood during this time. So another story shows just how contentious the use of street trees as firewood became in post-war Berlin. And so during the Berlin blockade in October 1948, the Western Allies ordered the felling of every second street tree in their occupation zones to secure necessary firewood for the winter. Many citizens regarded the Allied order with disdain. They wanted to see reconstruction and replanting, not further destruction. But the Soviet military government had closed the transportation corridors to the western sectors, and their energy supply was a huge challenge. In contrast, Berlin's Soviet sector received coal supplies from the Soviet occupation zone and Poland. So although Berlin's government was able to negotiate a reduction of the initial amount of lumber production requested from street trees, the press in the Soviet sector was quick to instrumentalize the issue for propaganda purposes, quite literally using the discussion about street tree felling to further incite the first ideological battles of the Cold War. So what the West considered the fight for liberty was, as the communist press argued at the time, a disgraceful tree crime and a barbaric act. And as one of the daily newspapers that was first published by the Red Army summed up in one of its October articles in 1948, when it chronicled West Berlin's deforestation, they argued that everybody who muttered about a Berlin blockade and considered the airlift necessary was guilty of deforesting the city. So in various ways, street trees were used to achieve autarky, and they were used as weapons of defense, more or less directly. And here you see workmen treating trees, lining a street on Berlin's northwestern periphery. And this is a photograph from 1955. If we zoom out, this is what this looked like. And what they're doing here, they're treating trees that in the last weeks of the Battle of Berlin were actually outfitted with explosives, so that the explosives could be set off and basically fell those trees so that they would fall across the street and produce tank traps. This is a road that is near an airport, and so they were trying to slow down the Allies' access to the city of Berlin. And this was discovered only in 1955. Those explosives had been overgrown by pure accident because one of these trees fell as a result of a lightning strike. And then they realized that there was a story behind this and were then removing these explosives at this point in time. So street trees literally and figuratively demarcated and delimited more or less porous boundaries, and they were used as instruments of identity politics in a positive and in a negative sense. Political conflict and nativist ideologies were projected onto urban trees, and they became carriers and signifiers of xenophobic sentiment. Street trees were planted with the intention of evoking feelings of neighborhood and citywide pride and belonging. So, for example, New York City's 1943 planting lists for post-war street tree planting showed the predominance of different species in the various boroughs. So there was Oriental Plane in Manhattan, Norway Maple and Oriental Plane in Brooklyn, Pin Oak, Linden, and American Elm in the Bronx, Pin Oak in Queens, and a mixture of Norway Maple, Pin Oak, and Red Oak in Richmond, which is Staten Island. So Berlin's citywide tree planting concept after the fall of the wall ensured the city's renown as the city of lindens. So linden trees planted along Berlin's most famous boulevard onto the linden that you see here in 1967 and its many radial streets had a centripetal and unifying effect at various moments in the city's history. Yet at times, certain species also evoked xenophobic reactions, demanding their eradication and replacement. In New York City, opinions about the ailanthus, the tree of heaven that is no longer planted, varied over time and moved between assessments of most and least ideal street trees. So originally imported to the United States in the late 18th century, in New York City, it caused discussion, inspired an affectionate poem, as you well know, and also the title of a famous book. So Betty Smith's The Tree Grows in Brooklyn. In 1941, famed landscape gardener Andrew Jackson Downing gave the ailanthus his blessing as an ideal street tree. Among the reasons for this metropolitan favorite, as he said, were its survival in meager and barren soil, its short leaf fall period coinciding with the first frost, And most importantly, Downing's praise for the tree being perfectly free from insects, as he said. But the enthusiasm did not last long, not even with Downing himself. So in the 1850s, a debate erupted about the suitability of the species that had in the 1830s and 1840s been planted in great numbers along Manhattan streets. And the political climate of the 1850s that was increasingly characterized by the nativist and anti-immigrant sentiment of the Know Nothing movement, opinions began to change. The discussion that included fierce outcries against the tree, as well as appeasing but definite arguments for it, was incited first by the odor of the male tree's flowers, and some years later by the notice that its bark contained poisonous oils. Troubled by the oppressive, nauseating, and poisonous male flower odor, as some said, many citizens began to consider the ailanthus a nuisance and public health hazard. Their xenophobic criticism soon incriminated the imported species as filthy and worthless foreigner and fragrant stranger that should be replaced with hardy, sweet, and indigenous species. So these were all quotes of the time. Downing himself contributed to this debate that unfolded after his death by opening an editorial to his journal, The Horticulturalist, with the warrior cry, "Down with the ailanthus." So caught by this nativist wave, Downing now saw the ailanthus, and I'm quoting him, as a usurper in rather bad odor at home, which has come over to this land of liberty under the garb of utility to make foul the air with its pestilent breath and devour the soil with its intermeddling roots. A tree that has the fair outside and the treacherous heart of the Asiatics, and that has played us so many tricks that we find that we have caught a Tartar, which it requires something more than a Chinese wall to confine within limits. So very discriminatory, obviously, as you can see. So in contrast, those in favor thought that the ailanthus absorbed as much odor from the city's streets as it emitted aroma. They considered the tree one of the city's principal ornaments and cherished its various qualities. In 1902, the Park Department's landscape architect Samuel Parsons reported that whereas 56 trees planted along 59th Street in Manhattan had died due to too shallow soil above the rock subsurface, a nearby feral ailanthus had split the rock and was growing profusely. So by the time the Park Department had finally taken charge of street trees in the 1910s, fewer ailanthus trees were then being planted, but the tree was still on the planting list. And in 1913, the Park Department planted 32 ailanthus on one street, which was basically the second largest number of one single tree species that was planted in Manhattan after the Oriental Plain in those years. So street tree advocates, on the one hand, appreciated the tree of heaven for its lush green foliage, tropical effect, and luxuriant oriental appearance, as well as its hardiness and resilience. But they also warned of its brittle wood and the tree's straggly, uneven growth that caused a rather unsightly appearance in the winter, as some said. By the 1960s, the ailanthus had been abandoned from the desirable species list, and its planting of street tree was no longer permitted. The species was simply too costly to maintain and manage as ideal and standardized street tree. The argument went, and undesirable along streets, it was now also objected to in other types of plantings where it had become a weed because it displaced more desirable tree and shrub species. Depending on the context of the times, the conception of the ideal street tree depended as much on species characteristics and the respective urban environment as it did on politics. So the topic of trees attracted attention from both progressives and conservatives, but particularly from the latter. And on both sides of the Atlantic, many early nationalist conservative landscape designers, for example, embraced trees, and in some cases also published quite expansive books on trees and their use in urban and rural environments. In the years after World War II, when landscape designers sought to use trees and large-scale tree planting to protect Berlin from desertification, they uncritically continued the association of cities with steppes or deserts, an association that was common in anti-urban conservative and nationalist circles in the previous decade. So eugenics and race theories had bolstered this connection already in the early 20th century, and many conservatives believed that urbanization threatened the so-called Germanic race that was considered superior by many in Germany at the time. And that was considered to have evolved in the wooded areas of the temperate zone, now deforested and threatened by desertification. So tree planting was therefore perceived as salvation to the so-called Germanic race. Not only were trees thought to cleanse the air and provide shade and lumber, but the argument was that by providing a healthy living environment for the Germanic race, trees could also prevent the so-called southern race from taking over. So again, what we see here also is anti-Semitic sentiment that is playing out in these arguments. But as much as sweet trees were used to protect and segregate, they were also used to overcome physical and mental boundaries. Various citizen groups planted sweet trees to reclaim their right to the city. In New York City, women and African Americans respectively used sweet tree planting to reclaim their right to the city. So in the early decades of the 20th century, female New York philanthropists, social reformers, activists, and early design professionals played an important role in urban tree planting and preservation. They embraced sweet trees as a means and symbol of empowerment, emancipation, and even resistance. Initiating sweet tree planting campaigns, the women transgressed to the separation of private and public spheres and the binary of male-coded architecture and female-coded nature. Whereas the city and its marketplace were largely determined and controlled by men, around the turn of the century, trees, which were considered an element of refinement and civility, both began to symbolize the female transgression of the domestic and public spheres and to be a means and material for this transgression. So in the 19th century, the luscious tree-lined streets of the residential neighborhoods outside of Manhattan's business district had still acted as an indicator of the refined domestic female sphere. But by the turn of the century, initiatives to plant trees in the business district and near the city center were a way for women to quite literally break out of the domestic sphere and claim and mark their place and space in the public realm. Street trees therefore both marked and created elite and female space in the city. While the turn of the century female activists, reformists, and philanthropic ventures were elitist endeavors that have continued, in times of crises, working and middle-class women discovered tree planting as a way to shape and claim their right to the city as well. So World War I, for instance, propelled women with and without horticultural training in German cities to tend to street trees and take over from men. In the United States, African American grassroots activism, often led by women, also began a street tree planting campaign. In 1964, African American residents of the Brooklyn Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood began to improve neighborhood blocks through tree planting. Many streets in Bedford-Stuyvesant turned from this to this in only half a century. And African American citizens transformed trees basically into a means of empowerment and emancipation within the civil rights movement. Through planting and maintaining trees, they asserted their rights to the city and to its spaces in general. Tree planting and conservation activities provided the most vulnerable and powerless groups with a way to make themselves heard and seen. Plant-ins became their tool of community building, as well as a civil right that could be used against ghettoization. One of the things distinguishing the tree planting activities from other civil rights initiatives was not only their grassroots, or we could say tree roots, do-it-yourself and self-help character, but their aesthetic. So trees made a difference in a visual and in a spatial sense, as well as in the more ephemeral atmospheric sense. Trees could fill the visual and phenomenological gap between top-down policies and the actual experience in the neighborhood. In 1967, as a result of the grassroots initiatives that drew the attention of Mayor John Lindsay, the park department instituted the tree matching program. So that meant that for every 4 trees that a block association planted, it would receive 6 additional ones from the city. But trees were and still are not always considered beneficial amenities in urban streets, as you will be aware. Today, many disenfranchised citizens oppose tree plantings because they fear losing their homes as a result of gentrification. And especially beginning in the 1950s and 60s, some citizens viewed street trees as obstacles against clear oversight on inner city streets. They feared that trees would provide hideouts for criminals. So the relationship between top-down and bottom-up initiatives for the protection and management of street trees in East and West Berlin in the 1970s and 80s is, of course, also of interest. And at the time, street trees were dying because of increasing traffic, air pollution, and the use of de-icing salts. So for East and West Berliners alike, street tree planting, care, and protection was a means to oppose the respective state and its environmental politics. So I was just glancing at my watch here, and I'm seeing that I have, how are we actually on time? Is there a hard cut at 1 o'clock?
Well,
Adam?
yeah, so we do end it at 1, and
Okay.
there's a number of questions that have come in, so might
Okay.
be able to aim for another 1 or 2 minutes to kind of wrap it up and then feel
Okay.
Would that work?
Yes, absolutely. So I'll do that and wrap up some final thoughts. So I was talking about the relationship between bottom-up and top-down initiatives and the importance in the US, but also maybe giving you just another very quick example from a very different city or 2 different cities, East and West Berlin, where quite literally a new genre of art developed by activists and artist activists. You see some posters here that were actually created by a biographic artist who was indicting, in this case, the East Berlin government for their lacking environmental politics. And this ultimately led to the opposition movement against the East German dictatorship that ultimately kind of brought the fall of the wall in 1989 to gather people around environmental causes, so that basically environmental activism played a huge role in political opposition that ultimately led to the fall of the Berlin Wall and then the end of the Cold War. And I think this is actually a really good example for urban nature that many people take for granted, having global consequences and having an impact on global history, as it were. So it's seemingly kind of very small thing that becomes a big thing. And here we see East Berliners planting trees just in the year before the wall came down. And in West Berlin, in the 1960s, you had experiments for the sound buffering function of trees, which is what I'm showing you here. We also have initiatives that, again, in the East, I'm kind of switching again here between both cities in both parts of Germany at the time, the German division, where landscape designers are incredibly creative and they produce master plans, tree master plans for entire cities. This is for a new town, a new industrial town that was built in the 1950s in the GDR. These tree master plans are incredibly sophisticated. They work with the entire phytosociology of the region, and also use the respective kind of tree combinations that would work well in the respective region, and produce aesthetic images at the same time. So a pleasing kind of visual effect, as well as pleasing climatological effects as well. So these are kind of slab buildings that you see there in this area. So a very basic kind of industrially produced housing system, but then a very kind of sophisticated and actually kind of creative design in terms of planting. So after the fall of the wall, tree planting plays an important role for reuniting the two cities, East and West Berlin. And this is what you see here happening in 1990 on the former border strip between East and West Berlin. People are gathering. This is again a bottom-up initiative. People are gathering around trees and are using this initiative to get together and also kind of cultivate a collective memory that these two people basically for a number of decades did not have. So I want to leave you with one last comment here, which is that Berlin is also a good example to show that basically trees which have this inbuilt a priori obsolescence, which is death, we could say has actually saved many trees from becoming truly obsolescent in our cities and has enabled them to persist. What you're seeing here are sections of this boulevard Unter den Linden at various times throughout the last 300 years. And you can see that there have sometimes been 6 rows of trees, sometimes only 4 rows of trees, but there have been trees. So trees have obviously been replanted. And this replanted boulevard is, we can say, actually now one of the oldest urban design elements in the city of Berlin. So it has persisted the centuries, whereas a lot of buildings have not. And I think that's an interesting thing to note. So basically it's this kind of malleability, the impermanence, if you so will, of the tree, which at the same time is an incredibly permanent element also, that basically has saved these trees. So on that note, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. That was fantastic. I enjoyed that talk very much. We have a few questions. So one of our first questions is about, it's relating back to the hygiene and sanitation part of your talk. They're asking, were these people colleagues or friends of Olmsted? Was there a broader swirl of awareness development about nature and health? And was this an influence on the Central Park development in New York City?
So most of the developments that I have been talking about came after the Central Park development. But you're absolutely right that Olmsted was very concerned about street trees as well. And so, this all belongs together. It basically all belongs to what has also been called the American Park movement. So it happens more or less at the same time. And the health concerns are a very big part in that discussion. I hope I'm answering that.
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
Our next question is relating back to early Washington, D.C. street tree monoculture. And so the species are varied by street and zone. Is this a biodiversity approach that is feasible to reduce insect or disease risks?
So that was the aim of doing this. So that was precisely the objective. We have some foresters and experts in the room, so I would I don't know, Adam and Molly and actually, if you want to kind of chime in on this. But this is, I think, a practice that more and more, I know that some landscape architects are actually thinking about alternating species along one and the same street for various reasons. But one of the reasons is precisely the resilience against insects, certain insects, but also other types of damage.
I guess just real quickly, Hugh, I see the question from you, and I think you are familiar with some of the stuff, but for those who maybe aren't, there are various technologies, structural soils that will support hardscaping and allow roots to grow underneath. So the short answer is yes, and this ongoing work to allow that spatialization of different hardscape, greenscape together in the same space.
Thank you, Adam. Another very interesting question. They're saying it's very interesting to learn about the historic interest in food production / security. And Kathleen Wolf was the one that asked this question. She's saying that I have colleagues and anthropologists who have studied urban foraging, informal plant use for food, fuel, and ceremonial and craft materials. And she's asking, what are contemporary perceptions or policies about city trees and practical uses?
Yeah, I think that's a very timely question, because in fact, some cities have begun to establish food forests, for example, and are indeed also experimenting with planting fruit trees and other kind of trees that could be used, for various purposes along streets and in the public realm. In Copenhagen, oops, am I still there for some reason?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So sorry about this. So Copenhagen, for example, is one of the cities in Europe that is pursuing such a route now quite actively. But there are a number of US cities that have food forests, have begun to kind of establish food forests. Yeah.
We have another question relating to the tree plantings during Nazi Germany. So they're saying that the Nazi leaders seem to promote racial purity, promoted native species for landscape plantings as a symbolic message of German natives. I always pronounce that wrong. But they're asking if you have any knowledge of this practice. So.
Yes, so basically that's what I hope to show, and also show in the book more extensively, that's precisely what is happening here. So planting native species is almost, you could say, as a Nazi ideology, is basically Nazi ideology transferred into, in this case, forestry, but also horticulture. And we see this in the use of certain forms and elements in design as well. So these seek to basically speak to the Nazi blood and soil ideology and politics, and basically symbolize and express this in physical form and physical shape. Yeah.
That's very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's a politicization of nature, which is happening.
And so looks like we're coming up on time. Do you want to do one more question, Adam? Okay. So this question is asking about your thoughts regarding using natives versus non-native invasive species in urban environments.
Yeah. So I think planting or site specific. So I think kind of you have to assess the individual situation, the individual site, and find the correct species for that site. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a native species. It could be a species that is imported and and that has been bred. And so it really kind of depends on the biophysical, the climatological conditions of the respective site. So, you know, I think one of the most important things is site-specific planting. And everything kind of else kind of for me kind of goes into these ideology, kind of wanders off into kind of ideological arguments that I hope we can evade that way in looking at the science and understanding what is best for our planet and for our people.
Thank you very much. This was wonderful, like I've already mentioned. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
I just mentioned the Trees Virginia YouTube page. That can be found on the Trees Virginia website. So tune in there. Within the next few days, we'll have this recorded presentation up there. So Sonja, thank you so much for taking time out of your day. It was an awesome presentation.
Thank you. Well, thank you everybody, and thank you to the audience. I hope you found it interesting, and keep planting. Yes.
All right.
Great. Bye. 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 Bye.
And
Bye.
bye.
Bye.